land where trust is as scarce as rain, one man paid 2 coins for a stranger's life. But what he found was worth more than gold. Will a broken soul and a hidden blade rewrite their story, or will the ghosts of the past keep them apart? The sun hung low over the Wyoming plains, painting the sky in streaks of amber and ash. In the shadow of a sagging barn on the edge of Laramie, a deal was struck, one that smelled of cheap whiskey and desperation. Clara, 8 months heavy with child, sat on a splintered crate, her wrists chafed raw from the rope her mother had, knotted tight. Her dress, once a soft blue, was now stained with dust and despair, clinging to her swollen belly like a fading memory of better days. She kept her eyes on the ground, not daring to meet the gaze of the man who'd just bought her freedom, or her chains. Elias stood across the barn, his silhouette sharp against the slanting light. His face was weathered, not by age, but by something heavier, something that carved lines deeper than time. He wasn't tall, but his presence filled the space, steady and unyielding, like the oak that refuses to bend in a storm. His voice, when he spoke, was low, gravelly, carrying the weight of too many unspoken words. "She needs care," he said, glancing at Clara's belly, then at the woman who'd brought her here. "Not a sale." Her mother, a wiry figure with eyes like chipped flint, snorted. "Care? She needs a man to keep her from ruin. Ain't no doctor gonna fix what's broken in her." She adjusted her shawl, her fingers stained with tobacco and greed. "You're getting a bargain, Elias. $2 silver, a bottle of rye, and a promise of 10 bushels of wheat come harvest. Take her, or I'll find someone who will." Clara's hands tightened in her lap, her nails digging into her palms. She felt the weight of the small knife sewn into the hem of her skirt, a secret she'd carried since the day she learned her mother's heart was colder than the winter winds. She didn't speak, didn't beg. She'd learned long ago that words were as useless as tears in this place. Elias didn't look at her. His eyes were fixed on a crack in the barn wall, as if he could see something beyond the warped wood. A memory, perhaps, or a regret. "I ain't looking for trouble," he said finally, "but I'll take her." He reached into his coat, pulled out 2 dull coins, and tossed them to the ground. They landed in the dirt with a soft thud, followed by the clink of a whiskey bottle set on the crate beside Clara's mother. The woman snatched the coins, her lips curling into a smirk. "Don't let her fool you," she said, untying Clara's ropes with a roughness that made her wince. "She's more trouble than she's worth." Clara stood slowly, her legs trembling under the weight of her pregnancy and the shame that clung to her like dust. Elias nodded toward a horse tied outside, its coat gleaming with the sweat of a long ride. "Let's go," he said, his voice neither kind nor cruel, just empty. Clara climbed onto the wagon, her hands gripping the edge as if it might anchor her to a world that kept slipping away. She didn't look back as the barn faded into the dusk, didn't watch her mother count the coins. Her throat burned, but she swallowed the ache. Crying was a luxury she couldn't afford. The ride to Elias's homestead was a quiet one, broken only by the creak of the wagon wheels and the howl of the wind across the open plains. The land stretched out endless and unforgiving, dotted with sagebrush and the skeletons of long-dead trees. Clara's fingers brushed the hidden knife, her only companion in a world that had never been kind. She stole glances at Elias, his hands steady on the reins, his eyes fixed on the horizon. What kind of man buys a woman he doesn't know, she wondered. What kind of man buys silence? They reached his home as the stars began to pierce the sky. It was a small cabin, weathered but sturdy, sitting alone at the edge of a shallow valley. No fences, no neighbors, just the wild and the wind. Elias helped her down, his touch brief and careful, like he was handling something fragile but dangerous. "Inside," he said, pointing to the door. "You'll have a room. Food's on the table." He didn't wait for her to respond, just turned to unhitch the horse. Clara stepped into the cabin, the air warm with the scent of pine and fresh-baked bread. A single lantern cast soft shadows across the room, illuminating a table set with a loaf and a jar of honey. Above the fireplace, a faded photograph caught her eye. A woman with kind eyes and a smile that seemed to hold a secret. Clara's heart quickened. Who was she? And why did this house feel like it was waiting for someone else? She found her room, small but clean, with a bed draped in a quilt stitched with care. A basin of water sat by the window, next to a brush and a pair of boots, too new to have been worn. Clara sank onto the bed, her hand slipping to the knife in her skirt. She didn't trust this quiet, this kindness. Not yet. Outside, the wind sang a lonesome song, and Clara wondered if she'd traded one cage for another, or if this place, this man held a different kind of promise. What secrets does this silent cabin hide? And will Clara's blade cut through them before they cut through her? The Wyoming dawn broke softly, spilling pale gold through the cabin's small windows. Clara woke to the scent of fresh bread and the faint hum of a kettle on the stove. Her room, small but warm, felt like a borrowed space, as if it belonged to someone who'd left long ago. The quilt on her bed was stitched with patterns of wildflowers, each thread placed with care, and the sight of it made her chest tighten. She ran her fingers along the fabric, wondering who had made it and why it felt like a promise kept in silence. The knife, still hidden in her skirt, pressed against her thigh, a reminder that trust was a luxury she couldn't yet afford. Outside, Elias was already at work, his figure a dark outline against the rising sun. He moved with purpose, splitting wood with steady swings of an axe, his breath visible in the crisp morning air. Clara watched him through the window, her hands resting on her swollen belly. He hadn't spoken to her since last night's arrival, hadn't asked questions or demanded answers. His silence was unnerving, not heavy like her mother's, but vast, like the plains that stretched beyond the cabin. What kind of man lives so far from the world, she thought, and what does he want from me? She stepped into the main room where a plate of cornbread and a small bowl of honey waited on the table. Beside it sat a tin cup of water, still cold from the well. Clara hesitated, then sat, breaking the bread with careful fingers. It was warm, soft, the kind of bread made by someone who knew hunger and chose to fight it. She ate slowly, her eyes drifting to the photograph above the fireplace. The woman's face stared back, her smile gentle but distant like a star that had burned out long ago. Clara's gaze lingered on the empty space where a child should have been in the woman's arms. The absence felt like a question no one dared to ask. Elias entered, his boots heavy on the pine floor. He carried an armful of kindling which he stacked neatly by the hearth. "You sleep all right?" he asked, his voice low, almost swallowed by the crackle of the fire he began stoking. Clara nodded, her throat tight. She wanted to ask about the photograph, about the woman, about why a man like him lived in a house that felt like a shrine. But the words stayed locked behind her teeth. Instead, she said, "The bread's good, thank you." He glanced at her just for a moment, his eyes catching the morning light. They were gray, like storm clouds holding back rain. "There's more in the pantry," he said, then turned back to the fire. Clara watched the way his hands moved, deliberate and worn, as if they'd carried more than wood in their time. She thought of the knife in her skirt, of the stories she'd heard in Laramie, tales of men who bought women for reasons darker than silence. But Elias didn't look at her like those men. He didn't look at her at all. That night, sleep eluded her. The cabin was too quiet, the kind of quiet that amplifies every creak and whisper. Clara slipped from her bed, her bare feet cold against the floorboards. She moved to the window where the moon cast silver shadows across the valley. The knife was in her hand now, its blade catching the light as she held it close. She didn't know why she'd taken it out. Maybe to feel safe, maybe to feel something other than the ache in her chest. Outside, she saw Elias on the porch, sitting in a weathered rocker, a lantern flickering beside him. He was mending a bridle, his fingers threading leather with a patience that seemed to belong to another life. He spoke softly, to no one, his words carried away by the wind. "You always said this land could heal," he murmured. "I'm still waiting." Clara froze, her breath catching. The words weren't meant for her, but they landed like stones in her heart. She stepped back, the knife trembling in her grip. This man wasn't her captor. but he wasn't her savior. Either. He was something else. A stranger carrying ghosts she couldn't yet name. She returned to her room, sliding the knife under her pillow. Not because she trusted him, but because the weight of his words felt heavier than her fear. As she lay in the dark, the baby kicked, a small, fierce reminder of life inside her. Clara pressed her hand to her belly, whispering, "We'll find our way." But the cabin's silence answered back, holding secrets that refused to speak. What? Ghosts linger in Elias's heart, and will Clara's courage uncover them before they pull her under? The days in Elias's cabin settled into a rhythm, like the slow beat of a heart finding its pace. Clara woke each morning to the same quiet gifts: a plate of warm cornbread, a jar of honey, a kettle humming on the stove. The silence between her and Elias wasn't sharp or cruel, but it held a weight, like a river carrying secrets beneath its surface. She moved carefully through the house, her hands often resting on her belly, feeling the baby's kicks as if they were Morse code for hope. But the knife in her skirt remained, a cold comfort she wasn't ready to let go. Outside, the Wyoming Valley stretched wide and wild, its grasses swaying under a sky that seemed to hold its breath. Clara took to sitting on the porch in the afternoons, watching Elias work, mending a fence, tending to the horse, or sharpening tools with a focus that bordered on reverence. He spoke little, but his actions were steady, deliberate, like a man who'd learned to measure his worth in deeds rather than words. Clara began to notice the small things, the way he left a bucket of fresh water by her door, the way he never entered her room without knocking. It wasn't kindness, not exactly. It was something deeper, something that felt like respect born from loss. One afternoon, as clouds gathered low and heavy over the valley, a sharp rap at the door broke the stillness. Clara, peeling apples at the kitchen table, froze, her fingers tightening around the knife. Elias opened the door, revealing a woman in a gray bonnet, her face as hard as the rocky slopes beyond. "Martha," Elias said, his voice even, like he'd been expecting her. The woman's eyes, sharp and unyielding, slid past him to Clara. "Heard you took in a stray," Martha said, her lips curling. "Thought I'd see for myself." Clara stood, her pregnancy unmistakable under the loose cotton dress Elias had left folded on her bed days ago. Martha's gaze lingered, cold and appraising. "Well, ain't she a sight?" she said, her voice dripping with disdain. "Carrying a child and no ring on her finger. What's the story, Elias? You playing? Savior now or just lonely?" Clara's cheeks burned, but she held her ground, the knife hidden in her apron pocket a silent reassurance. Elias didn't flinch. "You here for something, Martha?" he asked, his tone flat but firm. The woman smirked, stepping closer. "Eggs, if you've got 'em, and answers if you're willing. Folks in town are talking. Say you paid good coin for a girl who's nothing but trouble. Say she's running from something, or someone." Her eyes flicked to Clara's belly. "Guess it's plain enough what she's running with." Clara's hand twitched toward the knife, but she stopped herself. She wanted to speak, to hurl back the truth, that she hadn't chosen this, that her mother's betrayal had left her. No choice. But the words caught in her throat. Elias stepped between them, his broad shoulders a quiet barrier. "Eggs are in the coop," he said, nodding toward the yard. "Take what you need." He handed her a small basket, his movements calm but final. Martha snatched it, her eyes still locked on Clara. "She won't last," she said, her voice low, almost a hiss. "Girls like her never do." She turned and left, her boots kicking up dust as she crossed the yard. Elias closed the door, not with a slam, but with a soft click that echoed in the silence. Clara waited for him to say something, to deny Martha's words, to explain why he'd let her venom hang in the air unchallenged, but he only returned to the table, picked up his carving knife and began whittling a piece of cedar, the shavings falling like whispers to the floor. Clara's hands trembled as she sat, her mind racing. She looked at the photograph above the fireplace, the woman's eyes seeming to watch her, not with judgment but with sorrow. "Why didn't you say anything?" Clara asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Elias paused, his knife still. "Words don't change what people think," he said finally. "They only make the noise louder." He met her gaze, and for the first time Clara saw something raw in his eyes. Not anger, not pity, but a flicker of pain that mirrored her own. She stood, her chair scraping the floor, and walked to her room. Closing the door, she leaned against it, her breath uneven. Martha's words stung, but Elias's silence cut deeper. He hadn't defended her, hadn't claimed her as anything more than a burden he'd paid for. Yet his actions, the bread, the water, the space he gave her, told a different story. Clara sank onto the bed, her hand resting on the quilt, its wildflower stitches soft under her fingers. She thought of the woman in the photograph, of Elias's murmured words about a land that could heal. Maybe he wasn't her jailer. Maybe he was as trapped as she was. What truths lie buried in Elias's silence, and will Clara find the strength to face them before the valley's whispers tear her apart? The Wyoming nights grew colder, the stars sharper, as if the sky itself was holding its breath. Clara had been in Elias's cabin for nearly 2 weeks, each day marked by the quiet rhythm of survival. Bread on the table, wood stacked by the hearth, and the unspoken distance between her and the man who'd paid for her life. She no longer flinched at every creak of the cabin, but the knife in her skirt remained, a silent vow to protect the child growing inside her. The photograph above the fireplace haunted her, the woman's eyes seeming to follow her, whispering questions Clara couldn't answer. Who was she to Elias? And why did this house feel like a tomb for someone else's dreams? One evening, as the wind howled across the valley, Clara sat by the window, her fingers tracing the wildflower stitches on the quilt. The baby kicked, strong and insistent, and she whispered to it, "You're braver than I am." The words felt like a confession, one she hadn't dared speak aloud. She thought of Martha's venom, of Elias's silence, of the life she'd left behind, a mining town where her mother's fists were as common as the whiskey stains on her apron. Clara had run once from a man who'd promised love and left her with nothing but shame. She wouldn't run again. Not yet. But the weight of the unknown pressed harder each day. Elias's kindness, the water, the bread, the space he gave her, was a puzzle she couldn't solve. Was it guilt? Pity? Or something deeper, something tied to the woman in the photograph? Clara needed answers, and the cabin's silence was no longer enough. She rose, her movement slow under the weight of her pregnancy, and slipped into the main room. The fire cast a warm glow, but Elias was nowhere to be seen. The porch door was ajar, the lantern's light spilling onto the wooden boards outside. Clara stepped out, the cold biting her cheeks. Elias sat in the rocker, a small wooden box in his lap, its lid carved with a delicate rose. He was reading a letter, yellowed and creased, his lips moving silently, as if the words were too heavy to speak. Aloud, Clara hesitated, then spoke. Who was she? Her voice was soft but firm, cutting through the wind. Elias froze, his hands tightening around the letter. For a moment she thought he wouldn't answer. Then he folded the paper, tucking it back into the box. Her name was Sarah, he said, his voice rough, like gravel stirred by a storm. My wife. She's gone now. He didn't look at Clara, his eyes fixed on the valley, where the moonlight painted the grass silver. Clara stepped, closer, her heart pounding. What happened to her? She asked, though she wasn't sure she wanted the truth. Elias's jaw tightened, and for the first time, she saw the lines of his face deepen, as if the weight of memory was pulling him under. She wanted children, he said finally. We tried, year after year. Each time hope came and went, buried in the earth behind the hill. His voice cracked just for a moment. 5 times we lost them, 5 markers out there, no names, just numbers. Sarah. She broke after the last one, said she couldn't stay in a place that took so much. He paused, his breath uneven. She left me, not in anger, but because she couldn't bear to stay. I buried her heart long before I buried her. Clara's throat tightened, her hand resting on her belly. She thought of her own child, of the fear that gripped her every time she felt its movements. I'm sorry, she whispered, the words feeling small against his grief. Elias shook his head. Don't be. I bought you because I know what it's like to be left behind. I couldn't let it happen to you or your child. His words landed like a stone in still water, rippling through Clara's defenses. She wanted to ask more, to know why he'd chosen her, but the rawness in his eyes stopped her. She turned to go, but paused at the door, looking back. Elias was still, the box in his lap like an anchor. You don't have to carry it alone, she said, her voice barely audible over the wind. He didn't respond, but his shoulders softened just enough to notice. Clara returned to her room, the knife still in her skirt but feeling heavier now, not with fear, but with understanding. She lay awake, the baby's kicks mingling with the echo of Elias's words. For the first time she saw him not as a stranger but as a man who'd paid for her life to save his own. What will Clara do with the truth of Elias's pain? And can she find her own redemption in a house built on loss? The Wyoming spring crept in slowly, coaxing green shoots from the stubborn earth. Clara no longer counted the days since her arrival at Elias's cabin. They blurred into moments of quiet routine, mending clothes, tending the garden, sharing meals under the glow of a single lantern. The knife she'd once clutched like a lifeline now lay untouched in a drawer, replaced by a fragile trust that grew like the wildflowers stitched into her quilt. Elias was still a man of few words, but his actions spoke louder. A repaired porch step, a basket of apples left by her door, a nod when their eyes met. Clara began to see the man behind the silence, not a savior, not a captor, but a soul as scarred as her own. Their evenings took on a new rhythm. Clara read aloud from a worn book of poetry she'd found on a shelf, her voice soft but steady, filling the cabin with words of love and longing. Elias listened from his chair by the fire, carving a small wooden horse, his hands steady but his eyes distant, as if the verses stirred memories he couldn't name. One night, Clara paused mid-line, her finger tracing a page. "Do you think love can grow in a place like this?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Elias looked up, his gray eyes catching the firelight. "It grows where you let it," he said, "but it takes time and courage." His words hung in the air, a bridge between their pasts and the uncertain future. But the peace was fragile, and the valley held its own dangers. One afternoon, as Clara hung laundry on a line strung between two pines, a sharp tang of smoke stung her nose. She turned, her heart lurching at the sight of a dark plume rising from the hills beyond the valley. The wind carried sparks, and the horizon glowed with an angry orange. Elias burst from the barn, his face taut with urgency. "Fire," he said, grabbing a bucket. "It's moving fast. We need to get to the stone shelter by the creek." Clara nodded, her hands trembling as she gathered a shawl and a canteen. But as she stepped toward the wagon, a searing pain ripped through her abdomen, dropping her to her knees. "Elias," she gasped, clutching her belly. The baby was coming now in the worst possible moment. His eyes widened, but he didn't hesitate. He scooped her into his arms, his coat smelling of leather and earth, and carried her through the thickening smoke. The trail to the shelter was narrow, lined with dry grass that crackled underfoot. The fire roared closer, its heat licking at their backs as Elias moved with a strength Clara hadn't seen before. "Hold on," he murmured, his voice steady, despite the chaos. "You're stronger than this." The stone shelter, half buried in a hillside, was a relic from a time when hope was younger. Elias kicked the door open, laying Clara on a blanket he spread across the cool floor. The walls muffled the fire's roar, but the air was heavy with smoke and fear. Clara's contractions came fast, each one a wave of pain that stole her breath. She gripped Elias's hand, her nails digging into his palm. "I can't do this," she whispered, tears streaming down her face. Elias knelt beside her, his voice low and fierce. "You can. You're not alone. Not anymore." Time blurred into a haze of pain and effort. Elias stayed by her side, wiping her brow with a damp cloth, his hand steady even as the fire's distant crackle grew louder. Clara clung to his presence, to the man who'd carried her through flames, who'd buried 5 children but refused to let her lose hers. And then, in a moment that felt both eternal and fleeting, a cry pierced the air. Not of fear, but of life. A baby's wail, sharp and defiant, filled the shelter. Elias wrapped the child in a clean cloth, his hands trembling as he placed her in Clara's arms. "A girl," he said, his voice breaking. Clara looked down at the tiny, squirming bundle, her heart swelling. "Rose," she whispered. "Her name is Rose." Outside, the fire began to falter, its fury spent against the valley's stubborn stone. Inside, the shelter glowed with the light of a single candle, casting shadows that danced like promises. Clara held Rose close, her tears falling onto the baby's soft hair. Elias sat back, his shoulders slumping, his face etched with relief, and something deeper, something that looked like hope. For the first time, Clara saw him not as a man bound by loss, but as one who'd fought for life, for her, for Rose. Can a child named Rose mend the wounds of a broken past? Or will the valley's scars demand more than they can give? The Wyoming Valley woke to a new spring, the earth softened by rains that washed away the scars of last year's fire. The cabin, once a silent refuge, now hummed with life. A cradle by the window, a patchwork quilt draped over a chair, the laughter of a child echoing through the walls. Clara stood on the porch, Rose balanced on her hip, the toddler's curls catching the sunlight like threads of gold. The rose bushes Elias had planted, stubborn and scrappy, had bloomed at last. Not a riot of color, but a handful of pale pink petals that clung fiercely to life. Clara smiled, brushing a finger against one delicate flower. "You're tougher than you look," she whispered, and Rose giggled, reaching for the petals with chubby hands. A year had passed since the night in the stone shelter, since Rose's cry had cut through the smoke and fear, binding Clara and Elias in a way neither had expected. The valley had changed, and so had they. Clara no longer moved through the cabin with caution, her steps sure and steady as she cooked stew or read poetry by the fire. Elias, too, was different, his silence less heavy, his gray eyes softer, as if Rose's laughter had chipped away at the walls he'd built. They worked side by side now, mending fences, planting herbs, sharing quiet moments that felt like promises kept without words. Clara's belly was round again, a new life stirring within her, and this time, the thought didn't fill her with dread but with hope. The townsfolk of Laramie, once quick to whisper poison, began to soften. Baskets of bread, jars of jam, and folded quilts appeared on the porch, left by neighbors who no longer saw Clara as a scandal, but as a survivor. One morning, a child's scrawled note arrived, tucked into a basket of apples. Sorry for what they said. Clara read it aloud to Elias, her voice catching. He looked up from carving a tiny wooden bird for Rose, his lips twitching into a rare smile. "They're learning," he said. "Takes time, but they're learning." Clara nodded, her hand resting on Rose's head. "So are we." One afternoon, Clara followed a path behind the cabin, Rose toddling beside her, clutching a single rose she'd plucked from the bushes. The trail led to the hill where Elias's 5 markers stood, their weathered wood softened by time and rain. Clara knelt before the smallest one, her fingers brushing the number etched into its surface. Rose mimicked her, placing her flower at the base, her tiny face serious. Clara's eyes stung, not with sorrow but with something deeper. A gratitude for the lives lost that had led her here, to this moment, to this child. She looked back at Elias, who stood at the edge of the hill, hat in hand, his silhouette steady against the sky. "They're at peace," she said softly. Elias nodded, his voice low. "And so are we." That evening, as the sun dipped below the valley, painting the clouds in hues of lavender and gold, Clara sat with Rose by the fire, reading from the poetry book. Elias joined them, setting a freshly carved rattle on the table. Rose squealed, grabbing it, and Clara laughed, the sound mingling with the crackle of the flames. "She's got your stubbornness," Clara said, glancing at Elias. He chuckled, a sound that warmed the room more than the fire. "And your fire," he replied, his eyes meeting hers. For the first time, Clara felt not like a stranger in his home, but like family. "Ours," she said, echoing his words from months ago, and the word felt like a vow. As the stars rose over the valley, Clara stood on the porch, Rose asleep in her arms. Elias stepped beside her, his hand brushing hers, not by accident, but with purpose. "You named her right," he said, looking at the rose bushes. "She's growing where nothing else could." Clara smiled, her heart full. "Some things need broken ground to bloom," she said, "like us." The valley stretched before them, alive with the hum of crickets and the scent of new earth, a testament to resilience, to love that grew in the ashes of loss. This story, like the roses in Elias's garden, reminds us of a truth woven into the fabric of the American West. Redemption often comes through hardship, and love can take root in the most unlikely places. In the late 19th century, women like Clara faced unimaginable challenges, sold, scorned, or abandoned, yet many found strength to rebuild their lives, shaping the frontier's heart. Their stories, often untold, echo in the courage of those who dared to hope against the odds. If Clara and Elias's journey stirred your heart, if you felt the spark of a rose blooming in ruin, please leave a like, share your thoughts in the comments, and subscribe to Wild West Love Stories. Hit the bell so you never miss a tale of longing, healing, and love that defied the untamed frontier. Join us for the next story, where broken hearts mend and miracles grow in the wild. What new dreams will rise from this valley, and who else will find love where only ashes remain?